A Star and a Stranger. Part 1, Chapters 1 to 4. Prologue. The first time Minji saw him, she wasn't meant to be there. She should have been at the after-party, posing next to her groupmates, flashing the ideal pose for every camera. That was the life of an idol, bright, loud, and on full display. But tonight it felt like too much. The attention that never waned, the endless scrutiny, the way every gesture was closely inspected with a magnifying glass, suffocating. So she left. With everything shut past midnight, the city was quieter. Minji pulled her hoodie low over her face and meandered through the deserted streets, allowing the cool air to wash over her. For the first time all day, no one was looking. No lights, no fans, no expectations. Just silence, until the sound of a loud meow floated to her. A scruffy little cat crouched next to a street lamp, swiping a paw at something she couldn't see. Minji knelt, her heart softening when the cat blinked at her. Its fur was patchy and its tail twitched nervously, but there was something resilient in the way it held itself. It was reminiscent of herself, perhaps. Rough around the edges a bit, but still standing. "You're out late too, huh?" she whispered. The cat cocked its head, then ran off. Minji rose with a sigh, ready to move forward. A voice pierced the stillness. "You found her." She froze. A man a few feet away, hands in his coat pockets, hair tousled as if he'd walked into the wind. His voice was soothing and almost calm, but there was something about the way he eyed her that was a bit curious. His gaze trailed to the cat that wrapped around his ankles, then back to her. He didn't recognize her, and for a moment Minji was no star, no more than a girl on a quiet street, meeting a stranger beneath the moonlight. She should have walked away, but there was something about him, that he seemed so comfortable, so unaffected by the outside world, that kept her there. And that was her first big mistake. Chapter 1, The Idle Life. Minji was used to pretending. It came with the territory, smiling despite fatigue, laughing when her heart hurt, dancing even when her legs cried out for rest. But tonight, the mask was harder to wear than ever. Everything was so perfect, so heavy on her chest, and she wondered how long she could keep that up. It did not matter to the cameras whether you were tired. Neither did the world. 5-minute break. Their manager called, though Minji could hardly hear her over the thumping in her ears. After hours of non-stop practice, her body screamed for relief, and her muscles ached. She sank back against the mirrored wall of the practice room, sliding down to sit on the floor. Her manager walked up, a stern look on her face. "Minji, you have been a mess lately. Is everything okay?" Minji forced a smile. "Just tired." Her manager's gaze sharpened. "You're the face of New Jeans. A single misstep, and all we've built could tumble around us. You need to be careful." The heaviness of her words weighed down on Minji's chest, yet she nodded, her smile straining. "I know. That. And it was suffocating because New Jeans' comeback was in 2 weeks. 5 girls. 5 perfect performances. No room for mistakes. Each step, each note, each expression needed to be perfect." It pressed too heavily down on her shoulders more than ever. She let out a quiet sigh, pushing a hand through her sweat-drenched hair as she surveyed the practice space. On one end, Hanny and Danielle were quietly having the best time of their lives, and their energy had no end. While stretching by the mirrors, Heron always looked tranquil and inscrutable. Hyen made a little hum of their new chorus and drummed her fingers on her knee. And then there was Minji, the leader, the nucleus, the one who was supposed to hold it all together. She picked up her phone, scrolling through unread messages and fans' comments. She was inundated with notifications and compliments. How great she looked, how perfect her voice was, how she embodied grace and talent. But it all seemed sort of distant to her, like it belonged to someone else. The ideal image everyone had of her was false, of course. Minji sighed and put her phone on lock, letting it sit on her lap. She shut her eyes for a moment, attempting to calm her breath. She could hear her groupmates filling the room as Hanny laughed, Danielle hummed, and Hyen tapped her fingers to the tone. It was familiar, even comforting, but tonight it just felt excessive. "You okay?" Minji blinked awake to Danielle looking over her with a frank concern that colored her usual gentleness. Her brow furrowed, her head tilted slightly as she scrutinized Minji's face. "I'm fine," Minji said, her words automatic. She smiled, a beat too easy, a beat too practiced. "Just tired." Danielle didn't look entirely convinced, but before she could say anything further, their manager clapped her hands. Break time was over. Her muscles protested, but Minji pushed herself back to her feet and got into position. The opening chords of their new song blared, bright, polished, everything the world wanted them to be. The music blared, and Minji's body moved without her permission, her limbs dancing along to the choreography she had run through thousands of times. But as her body swayed, her mind drifted. Lately they always did. Outside, the city had fallen silent. Streets she had strolled just last week were dark and empty. She pictured the scraggly feline with the golden gaze that seemed to bore into her, and then reflect back her soul. And she thought of him, the scruffy-haired stranger with the calm, curious voice. She couldn't stop thinking about him since that night. It was the way he had looked at her, like she was just a girl, not an idol, not a star. It was a sensation she hadn't known she needed until she felt it. Once the song was over, Minji returned to her senses. She gasped for breath, chest rising and falling quickly as the muscles in her legs quivered from exertion. The others were already picking up their things and talking excitedly about their plans for the night. "Yuni, you coming?" Hanny shouted through the door, raucous. "Wait," said Minji, putting on another forced smile. "I need a minute to be alone, to catch a breath." The silence that remained after the door had clicked shut behind her groupmates was a relief. Minji leaned against the mirror and shut her eyes again. The day's responsibilities sat heavy upon her, and it was not simply physical fatigue. It was the burden of expectations, of needing to be perfect, of never being allowed to take her guard down. She needed an escape. A few minutes later, Minji was standing at the door to the practice room, her phone held tightly in her hand. She was not supposed to be seeing the stranger this evening, yet the urge proved too difficult to resist. Framed in the half-open door, she took a deep breath, slipped out the back and into the night, her feet taking her toward the cafe. It was the first time in a long time she truly felt like making a choice. Not for new jeans, not for her fans, but for herself. The city was hers again. The streets were quieter now and the air was cooler. She walked with no destination, allowing the cadence of her feet to settle her thoughts. For the first time that day, she felt she could breathe. Then she heard it, a faint meow. Minji froze, skimming heartbeat for one destructive beat. She turned toward the sound, peering into the dimly lit alley. And there, next to a street lamp, was the scruffy cat from before. It stared up at her, tail twitching nervously. "You're back," Minji said, kneeling. She reached out a hand, but the cat did not move, only stared up at her with those gold eyes. For a moment, she thought of nothing but the game, the pressure, the expectations. Just her and the cat, alone in the stillness of the night. And then she felt it, a presence behind her. Minji whipped around, her throat closing up. There he stood, a few feet away, hands in the pockets of his overcoat. His hair was tousled, his face serene but curious. "You found her again," he said, his voice calm and even. Minji's heart raced. Of all the people she didn't expect to see, hadn't even known she was hoping to see, it was him. But now that he was here, she couldn't turn away. "Yeah," she said quietly, rising to her feet. "I guess I did." Left alone in the alley, the two turned to look at each other. The silence felt heavy, but not uncomfortable between them. For the few seconds it took, it felt as if the world had hit pause, within and beyond their own, allowing them space in this moment to exist together. "You shouldn't be out here this late," he said after a beat, his tone easy but reproving. "It's not safe." Minji cocked her head, a small smile playing on the edges of her lips. "And you are?" A soft laugh slipped from him, soft and surprising. "Touché." Neither of them spoke for a moment. The city buzzed all around them, but in that alley, it was as if they were the only two people in the world. "I need to go," Minji said finally, even though her feet didn't move. He nodded, his eyes held steady on hers. "I won't stop you." But just as she made to leave, she stopped. It was something about him, something she didn't have the words for, that made her want to stay, want to know more. "What's her name?" she said, looking back at him. "The cat, I mean." He smiled slightly, his eyes softening. "Ghost. She's not anywhere, but always arrives at the time you least expect her." Minji smiled faintly at that. "She suits the name." He looked at her for a moment, as if trying to figure her out. "What about you?" he asked, still quiet but curious. "Do you have a name?" Minji held back, spine tingling. For a split second, she thought about using a fake name, something for protection. There was just something in his eyes, something honest and unguarded, that made her want to be honest too. "Minji," she whispered, voice barely above a whisper. "Just Minji." He nodded as if just the name was enough. "I'm Xavian." Xavian. It was a name that stuck in her mind, simple yet intriguing. That suited him, quiet, unassuming, yet with a hard-to-miss presence. For a moment, they both remained silent. The tension between them hung in the air like a charged thing, as if a line had been crossed, but they were both too aware to put a label on it. "I should go," Minji repeated, though this time with more authority. But even as she said that word, she experienced a twinge of reluctance. Xavian nodded, his face inscrutable. "Be careful." Minji was just about to turn to walk away when she felt her heart thumping in her chest. She didn't look back, but she felt his eyes on her until she rounded the corner and vanished into the night. She returned to the dorm with a mind racing. Xavian. The name reverberated through her mind, hauntingly familiar, yet a connection she could not articulate. She didn't know what it meant, or whether it meant anything at all. But for the first time in a long while, she felt something other than the weight of expectations. She felt alive. Chapter 2, Strangers in the Night. Xavian wasn't searching for someone. Most nights he liked the quiet, the hum of the city when the world was too occupied to hear him. But since Minji had come into his life, the silence was different. It was not simply peace anymore. It was an emptiness waiting to be filled. And for the first time in years, he wanted to fill it. He liked being invisible. It was easier that way. No expectations. No questions. Just his own footsteps echoing through deserted streets. But that night, someone had noticed him. And now he couldn't shake her from his mind. He hadn't intended to speak when he saw her again. He should have phoned Ghost and bounced. But there was something about how she knelt in the alley, her hoodie slipping just enough to let a few strands of hair escape, that made him unable to stay quiet. And when she looked up at him, wide-eyed and a little unsure, this wasn't just some random encounter. It felt like something more. Ghost wove between his legs as he rested his elbows against the railing of the bridge, her quiet purring nearly lost in the din of the distant city. The air was a little cooler tonight, but he didn't care. He liked the chill. It kept him grounded. He looked to the cat, absent-mindedly stroking her fur. "What do you think?" he murmured. "Is she yet another passerby?" Ghost went to stare up at him slowly, as if she knew something he didn't. He let out a quiet laugh. "Yeah, thought so." At this point, he should have moved on with his life, let it simply fade out of memory. She was nothing more than a stranger in the night, after all. But how she pronounced her name stayed with him. It wasn't like the way most people introduced themselves, all flash and charm. No, there was something just honest about her saying that. "Minji." He rolled the name around in his head, trying it on for size. It didn't sound like a lie, and yet it didn't make sense. Xavian had nothing much to look at in his apartment, small, calm, resting at the fringes of the city where no one paid mind. Just the way he liked it. He stepped through, and the lock clicked softly behind him as Ghost slipped between his legs and raced toward her favorite place on the windowsill. The city lay below him, bright and infinite, but it felt distant, as if it were someone else's. He leaned back against the wall and exhaled heavily. His mind should have now been quiet, but tonight she lingered. Minji. How her name had sounded in the air. The way she'd kind of hesitated, like she was deciding how much of herself to show. It was no longer just curiosity. It was something far deeper, something he hadn't experienced in ages. And that was dangerous. Xavian's green gaze drifted to the window, where Ghost perched on the sill, her golden eyes shining brightly as they reflected the city lights. "What do you think, Ghost?" he murmured. "Should I let her in?" The cat blinked lazily as if to say it's your call. But it wasn't that simple, Xavian knew. 2 years ago, he'd made the mistake of putting his trust in someone, and she'd taken everything. He lived now at the edge of the world, where no one asked questions and no one cared who he had once been. But Minji, she was the one who made him want to come out of the darkness, even if it meant sacrificing everything. He'd learned long ago that some people were better kept at arm's length. Get them too close, and they'd begin asking questions. And in the blink of an eye, the quiet life you'd constructed evaporated. Xavian had not wished to be found. He stepped over to the counter, throwing his keys onto the table. City lights broke through the window as a pale glow, shadows stretching the length of the room. He braced against the lip of the counter, willing the thoughts away. He had become skilled at staying out of sight. He had been gliding through life for years like a wisp, always observing, but never participating. It wasn't loneliness. It was survival. But then there were nights like this. Nights when the past slipped in despite his best efforts to bury it. His life had once been a different thing. 2 years ago, he was not just some guy unsafely walking with some stray cat. He'd had a plan, a future. People who depended on him. Until it all fell apart. A mistake. A betrayal. A life he'd been forced to abandon. And now he was no one. Just another dude in the crowd. He wanted it that way, he told himself. So why was he unable to just let her go? He had no right to care who she was. It shouldn't have mattered. But the way she'd looked at him, like she was really curious, not suspicious, wasn't something he was used to. It was because most people cared only about what they could extract out of you. Minji didn't. At least, not yet. Ghost purred quietly, breaking up the silence. She had curled up beside the window, her golden eyes following him as if she knew more than she was letting on. Xavian shook his head and pushed away from the counter. He should stop feeling about her. Their paths had crossed twice, and that should have been the end. But in his own heart he knew it was not. Chapter 3, Between Two Worlds. Minji should have been asleep. It was 2:14 a.m. when the bright numbers on her phone said, but her mind was not allowing her to settle down. Visions of Xavian remained, his steady voice, the way he stared at her like she was more than an idol. It made her dangerous, she knew, to allow herself to think of him. But for the first time in years, she had the sense that someone saw her. Not Minji of New Jeans, just Minji. As she lay on her bed, staring up at the ceiling of her school's shared bedroom, mutters and rumblings from the city a few blocks away barely sliced through the cracked window. Hundreds of people had mingled in her orbit since debut. Fans, producers, stylists. But none of them appeared like him. Xavian. His name wouldn't leave her alone. Stubborn, strong, unshakable. She had told herself that their initial meeting was a coincidence. Some random encounter that meant nothing. But twice, that was something different. And the way he looked at her like that tonight, calm, inquisitive, as though he couldn't have cared less who she might be, stayed with her longer than it should have. She turned over with a soft sigh, pulling the blanket closer to her shoulders. What was she even doing? If anyone found out she'd been wandering around the city alone, not to mention talking to strangers, it would be chaos. She could already hear her manager's voice scolding her about image and privacy, and how one rumor could destroy everything they'd built. And yet, she had no regrets. A subtle rustle on the other side of the room. Looking over, Minji found Hanny asleep, her face half buried in her pillow. The others had collapsed, worn out from a long day of practice, schedules, appearances hours ago. Things in the world had felt heavier of late. The lights, the cameras, the nonstop grind of New Jeans Minji, it was everything she'd ever really wanted, but at some points it felt like she was killing herself in the name of the image. Out there, in the quiet of the city, she could breathe. And Xavian, he was like a question she didn't know how to answer. When Minji's alarm went off at 6 a.m., she had hardly slept. She forced herself out of bed, limbs drowsy with tiredness, the routine to start the day even more arduous. Rehearsals were starting early, vocal warm-ups, and then a full day of choreography. Another day molded by the expectations of others. By 7:30, she was already sitting in the company's practice room, lacing up her sneakers as the others filed in one by one. Danielle smiled at her with turned-up lips, and Heron turned to the wall, still half asleep. "Late night?" Hanny said gently as she flopped down next to her. Minji hesitated. Something like that. Hanny tilted her head, eyebrow raised in curiosity, but didn't ask. That was the thing about Hanny. She always knew when not to ask. Minji was grateful for that. Hours blurred together. By the time the sun rose again, Minji's body was tired from rehearsal. Though she was stretching her legs on the studio floor, her mind still wandered back to him. Did he walk these same streets night after night? Would she see him again? And most dangerously of all, what if she did? She was too wise to get attached. There was no space for anything outside the lines in her life. There's no room for secrets, no room for strangers. But Xavian, he seemed like the sort of mistake she wanted to make. When the others went to the dorm, Minji stayed. By the time she slipped through the back entrance, a hoodie was already pulled low over her face. The city wrapped itself around her again, cool air against her skin as she walked familiar streets. But she didn't know whether she was looking for him. But a part of her wanted him to be looking for her as well. It was a different sort of city tonight. Minji ambled aimlessly, dragging her feet across the pavement. Often those late-night walks cleared her head. That was her way of untethering herself from the burden of the spotlight, if only momentarily. But tonight, her brain wouldn't calm down. Her schedule was meant to sap her so much that she couldn't think. Tomorrow was a blur as well. Interviews, a photo shoot, a rehearsal for their impending comeback. There was no time for distractions. And yet, here she was, wandering again. She said she was not looking for him, she told herself. That it didn't matter whether she saw him or not. But deep down, she knew she was lying. When she returned to the dorm, the lights were already out. Minji tiptoed into the house and closed the door behind her, making sure to be as quiet as she could. Her mind, Drowning out Xavian, she poured a glass of water and went into the refrigerator humming on. She's not meant to be thinking about him. Whoever he was, whatever secrets he bore were not meant for her world. And yet, his voice was still in her head, calm, unbothered, as if he were somehow outside the clamor pressing in around her. What would it be like to live without the world looking in? She pushed the thought away and walked back into the bedroom. Sleep came slowly, but the morning after arrived all too soon. As the day dragged on, there was no time to catch her breath. A perpetual cycle of quick costume changes, practice runs, clicking cameras. Every gesture was measured, every smile meticulously pinned. By early afternoon, they were in the green room of a live music event. Makeup artists darted around them, taming stray hairs and patting powder over their faces. Minji sat quietly while the others spoke, zoning in and out of the frame as a stylist attached the clip on her microphone. Minji, focus, her manager's tiny voice pulled her back. She sat up straight in her chair. Sorry, long night? From beside her, Hyan teased lightly. Minji gave her a weak smile, but it was half-hearted. If only you knew. Hours later, after her set ended and the applause faded off into the distance, Minji, at last, allowed herself to exhale. The drive back to the dorm was quiet. Her groupmates dozed against the windows, but Minji only stared as the city passed right by. She should have left happy. The performance was perfect, their fans even louder. So why did it feel like something was missing? When they got home, the others piled inside the dorm, and Minji stood there in the doorway. And the city still called her name, an itchy pang in her skin. She wanted to shake it off, but this time she slipped away again. That night, the city felt a little lonelier. No stray cat, no quiet stranger, just Minji and the silence she could not escape.